Thank you for joining me for another episode of The Deeper Pulse. I'm back from a short break, and I am so thrilled to be bringing you a very special episode of the Culture series. Hello out there. It is so good to be back with you on the podcast. And as you may already know, I took a little travel break, and these past 3 weeks have really flown by. It's probably because I spent most of my time road tripping through Colorado, eating meals out of a Yeti cooler and visiting some of my old haunts. And I use the word haunt quite deliberately here. Chris and I spent 5 nights in an Airbnb in Boulder, and we booked our stay there months and months ago, around the first of the year when we landed tickets to see Brandi Carlile and the Indigo Girls at Red Rocks Amphitheater. If you've never been to Red Rocks, do yourself a favor and get there. It is arguably one of the best music venues in the country. Anyhow, the trip was planned months and months ago, and it was so crazy, somewhat synchronistic, to just happen to be in Colorado on the heels of releasing this very series. It just so happens that we were staying less than 2 miles from Alchemy of Movement, the dance studio where, in the fall of 2000, I was first introduced to a mind-body wellness practice that would turn the trajectory of my life on a dime. Soon after attending my first class, I began dancing at the studio 6 days a week, and less than a year later, I traveled to Santa Barbara, California to attend a week-long teacher training. I became totally enamored with the practice and the company, which I refer to as the org. I had already been somewhat exposed to the bittersweet lure of New Age wellness culture, but the ways in which this practice transformed my body and my way of walking in the world was undeniable. Let's just say I was all in. So while in Boulder, I decided to pay a quick visit to the studio where it had all began 20 years earlier. It was so surreal. I was flooded with memories as soon as I stepped through the doors. What's more, just down the street, less than a mile away, was the shopping center where the Dawn Center had once stood. Dawnok was another practice I became involved in around the same time. The space was now a used kids' clothing store, but it had once been a brightly painted dojo, where I'd been issued my first martial arts uniform, and I'd spent many hundreds of dollars I didn't have on weekend workshops and private energy work sessions that promised to prepare me for an enlightenment revolution. Now, I'm not going to go into all that here. You can circle back to episode 33 and the many others that follow if you want to hear that story. In a nutshell, I kicked Dawnok to the curb and I became an all-in devotee of the org, eventually working in the inner circle, overlooking red flags in favor of personal development, social status, and, most importantly, a wholehearted belief that I had finally found a sense of purpose in life. Eventually, things got so uncomfortable that I left the org. The culture felt toxic to me, but it would be many years before I'd come to understand that this was a common cultic experience. I couldn't see any of that at the time, so like most survivors, I walked away from one group only to find myself in another iteration down the road. I cycled through one culty culture after another, and the irony was that each new experience seemed to be offering me something that at the time felt like the antidote to whatever spell I'd most previously been under. You can think of it sort of as the smoke and mirrors of New Age wellness culture. In these environments, control is very often confused with connection, and lavish praise is traded for compliance and obedience. I didn't understand any of this at the time, and so I'd get frustrated and exit yet another environment because something just felt off. Eventually, I felt unable to trust my instincts, so I broke away from group dynamics altogether. Wary to join the ranks of another idealistic organization, I decided instead to build a private coaching practice. In the process, I sought online business training, and in a true plot twist that is a total mindfuckery, I'd later realize, way after the fact, that I myself had been trained in a variation of tried and true cultic systems of influence. Essentially, I learned to replicate coaching models that were designed to build a cult following through the use of laundered systems of influence and online sales funnels. Cha-ching, clickbait salvation. I never had much measurable capitalistic success using these models because, once again, I could feel that something wasn't quite right. In the spring of 2019, I finally just gave up. I let go of my teaching/coaching practice and I decided to devote myself to a question. What keeps happening? How is it that I keep seeing the same dynamics over and over again? I've since learned that despite my deep and unrelenting desire for autonomy, I will never actually be free from cultic influences until I am able to clearly understand and identify how exactly they operate. Knowing something isn't good for me just isn't enough. Saying no to one thing doesn't keep me from repeating the same cycle somewhere else. How did I get here is really the impetus for this series, which has rather gloriously led me to this week's episode and an insightful conversation with a very special guest. Janja Lalich is a sociologist and a world-renowned cult expert who some of you may even recognize. She's been featured in documentaries like Heaven's Gate, Cults and Extreme Belief, and Seduced Inside the Nexium Cult. Dr. Lalich is a professor emerita of sociology at California State University and has been studying the social psychology of controversial groups and exploitative and abusive relationships for 30-plus years. She is an international authority on cults and coercion, has written and lectured extensively, advised the international intelligence community on extremism and indoctrination, and has served as consultant and expert witness in civil and criminal cases. Now, semi-retired, Janja still works as a researcher, author, and educator, specializing in recruitment, indoctrination, and coercive methods of influence and control. She's the author and/or co-author of 6 books, including the now classic Take Back Your Life, Recovering from Cults and Abusive Relationships. In addition to working with survivors and their families, Janja leads workshops and educational sessions for government agencies, private companies, educational institutions, and nonprofit organizations. Janja's work has been profound, giving language to my own journey of recovery. Early on in this series, I very innocently tagged her in an Instagram post. She reached out to me in support, and with an offer to be a guest on this podcast. We've had a few false starts, but we finally had the chance to sit down together via Zoom just a little over a week ago. I kind of think it's fitting that this episode just happened to be recorded while I was in Boulder, trying to make sense of how and why it's taken me 2 decades to extricate myself from the unhealthy dynamics of culty culture. And a quick spoiler, it turns out that Janja is not only a world-renowned expert on all things cultic, she's very generous with her own story, and also just a pure delight. I have a feeling you will enjoy our conversation just as much as I did.
Hello.
Hi, Janja. It's so good to finally see you and meet in person. This is great.
It only took, a couple of months?
Yeah. Yeah, life just keeps happening, doesn't it?
Yeah, now, we've had this heat wave and ant invasions and
Uh-huh. Yeah, it's nonstop these days,
yeah,
right?
it is. Yeah, it is.
I'm coming to you from an Airbnb in Boulder, and there's
You're in Boulder. Okay.
in Boulder, Colorado. Yeah, we're on a road trip, and there's roosters crowing outside and dogs barking and traffic, and I'm like, we're just doing this.
Yeah, same here. I've got these guys outside sanding and drilling, and we just have to try it.
Yeah, we'll just roll with it. It'll be great. Well, I'm so grateful for you. Well, all the shuffling to make this happen, and just that you agreed to do it at all just means a lot. So I'm really grateful to be here with you. I have so many questions for you, of course, and your work, I want you to know on a personal note, has been really profound for me. Particularly your book, Take Back Your Life, has just, I've gone through it 3 or 4 times, and each time another little nugget rises up and just gives language to experience that I had, and just really helps me to heal, really, to take back my life and to make sense of so many experiences that I have where I felt I knew something was off. I just couldn't articulate and put into words what it was. And I can't recommend your book enough in terms of the language that it gives to so many of these dynamics. So I just want to say how grateful I am for the work that you do.
Well, thank you. Maybe I could hire you to do an ad.
It would be a very easy thing for me to do. So anytime. So just to share, I'm trying to think of exactly how I first was exposed to you. I think it was probably through Sarah Edmondson and Nippy Ames, their work, a little bit culty. I'm not sure if I listened to the interview with you on that podcast first or if I read something from her, but I grabbed the book and I've just fallen down the Janja Lalich rabbit hole, watching all the things. And then circling back to documentaries I had seen and realizing that I had already seen you, you know, offering your expertise. And are you involved in the second season of The Vow that's coming out?
Well, apparently I'm in for 1 second.
1 second.
I know. I spent weeks with them. I mean, they filmed me because I stayed in an Airbnb with 5 or 6 of the women. And it was incredible. And they filmed me like they filmed me sleeping and snoring on the couch. And I mean, they just filmed me constantly.
Wow.
We were all going to the trial during the day. And I mean, it was so intense. And then the conviction happened. And yeah, so apparently the only bit they're using is there's a scene where we're all kind of running out of the courtroom after the conviction. And I think that same video might have been in Seduced.
Right.
But anyway, yeah, I was kind of disappointed. I was like, oh my God, I spent with you guys. But I guess they had so much to cover. And, you know, it's always a crapshoot when you do those things.
Totally.
Yeah. So.
Yeah. Well, you are featured quite a bit in Seduced, though, if I remember correctly.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So that's a really great place for people to, particularly around the dynamics there with Nexium, a great resource for people to go to. I think that as far as a lot of the cult experts that I've tapped into, I think the way that you approach and explain things is just so relatable. And perhaps it's because, which maybe kind of leads me into my first question, for listeners who maybe aren't as familiar with your work, like how you got into doing what you do. If you don't mind, I'm sure you've told the story a million times, but just a little bit about your background. And I think one of the reasons why you're so potent at what you do is that you've walked the path before, right? Do you mind sharing a little bit about your personal history?
Yeah, not at all. So we probably have a few hours, I guess.
We might need it just for this part, right?
So when I was 30 years old, I moved to San Francisco. I had been living on an island off the coast of Spain for 4 years. I was a hippie before that. And, you know, I'd been to university and all of that. But anyway, it was time for me to leave the island. And I moved to San Francisco because one of my best friends from college was there. And there was a room in their house. And she was living with a group of women who had all gone to law school. It was kind of like this first wave of women who went to law school. So it was, you know, this was like late 1974. So the feminist thing was booming. We actually were living in the Castro. I was coming out as a lesbian. You know, all kinds of stuff was happening. And the Vietnam War had just ended. And so people on the left were kind of looking for, what do we do now? And so I met a woman who was a friend of a roommate, you know, one of these stories. And we would stop and have coffee and we'd have these great political discussions. And eventually at one point she invited me to join a study group. And there were a lot of study groups going on in the urban areas at that time among the left. So that seemed normal. And she said we were going to study women in the state, which sounded really interesting to me. And I thought, well, I'll meet new people. I'm new in town, blah, blah, blah. I didn't know, of course, that the study group was a front for a cult, an organization. They kept that secret. And of course, in the study group, we all took turns like leading the discussion of the reading that week. And so we were reading a lot of revolutionary stuff, you know, Lenin and Mao and things like that. And when it was my turn, of course, they praised me to high heaven like I was such a genius. And then they met with me again. They asked to meet with me again. And long story short, they told me there was this organization and didn't I want to join? And of course, I was very excited. And they said to keep it a secret because they didn't want everyone to know. And this was around the time of the Patty Hearst and the SLA incidents, if people know about that. And so there were a lot of, quote, red squads in all the police departments in the urban areas. And the FBI was looking for Patty Hearst and knocking on door. And they actually even knocked on my door because I opened up a new gas and electric account. So they were going to all the kind of new apartments. Anyway, I joined. I really didn't know what I was joining. It didn't have a name at that time. I wasn't really told there was a leader. I was told it was an all women's organization that was going to fight for social change. And So it sounded good to me. It sounded serious. And, I thought the fact that they were keeping it secret was a smart thing to do. So that didn't really surprise me. And well, before I knew it, I was I was pretty quickly brought up the ranks. My first assignment was secretary to the central committee. So I would sit in on these meetings of the top leadership, like 6 women, and have to take the minutes and then type them all up and deliver them to each of their houses before 6 in the morning. So sleep deprivation started
Wow.
very early on. Anyway, it went from there. I mean, we grew. We had a lot of different front groups, which cults often do. I was always, I guess you would say, internal to the organization. I was always in leadership and leading classes and creating curriculum and on the discipline and control board, and was pretty much groomed by the second in command, the woman who had recruited me. And so I was quite a bitch. I mean, it was a very harsh world. We worked 20-hour days, 7 days a week, year after year. We spent a great deal of our time sitting around in circles and criticizing each other, which, self-criticism, we kind of adopted it from Chairman Mao in China, and it, basically breaking everyone down. And so I did that for 10 and a half years. The last 5 years, I was absolutely miserable and wanted to get out and couldn't figure out how to get out. I had no money. I had no family. I had nobody on the outside. I knew they'd come after me. I was terrified. And some little part of my brain was saying, well, maybe they're right. I should stay. Something wrong with me that I want to leave, all that.
I do.
And then kind of miraculously, the leader happened to be out of the country, and the leadership called together all the members, and we told them what was going on behind the scenes, and that the leader was an alcoholic and arbitrary and all the corruption. And it took a couple of weeks to convince people that we were telling the truth. And then everybody just started like pouring their stories out. It was just so emotional and very cathartic, but very emotional.
Yeah.
And the night before she was coming back, we took a vote, and we voted unanimously to expel her and dissolve the organization. So we all got out.
Wow.
Very unusual.
Yeah.
And at that point, there were probably 120 of us who were like the full-time cadre members. So then we all had to, go our merry way and get ourselves together. And we helped each other with resumes. And like I ran the publishing house, which was one of my jobs. And so everybody, when they applied for a job, they said they worked at the publishing house, and I would be a reference for them. And I went to New York to get away from San Francisco, and I figured I could get a job in publishing. And so I was both elated and miserable. I felt like I'd been let out of prison, and yet I just felt like the most complete weirdo. I was in New York City. I'd seen maybe 2 movies in 10 years. I just felt completely alienated from everybody. I'd have to go on these business lunches. I didn't know what to talk about, and it was really tough. And sort of a combination of factors happened that led me to realize I needed to be in therapy. And another miraculous thing, at the time, there was a cult clinic in New York where the therapist, worked with cult survivors and families. And I ended up getting the most incredible therapist who more than once saved my life. I had so much guilt and shame because I had been in leadership and I had done such shitty things to people. And so I was pretty suicidal a lot. Anyway, once I felt better, I moved back to San Francisco. New York was really tough in those years, drugs on the street and stuff. So I went back to San Francisco, and after 10 years out of the group, I finally went to grad school. It took me 10 years to make that decision. And I kept thinking, I can't do it. So I went to grad school and got my PhD and got the job teaching sociology at one of the California state universities. But all of that time, I was going to conferences and speaking about cults, especially political cults, because when I got out, which was 86, 87, all anybody talked about was religious cults. So I started going to conferences and meeting people and writing articles. And then I wrote the first version of Take Back Your Life, which was called Captive Hearts, Captive Minds. I think that came out in 94. And then I ended up being really good friends with and working with Dr. Margaret Singer, who
Oh,
was
wow, great.
the
Yeah.
clinical psychologist who was kind of the preeminent cult expert for decades.
Yeah.
She lived in Berkeley. And so we wrote 2 books together, and she was a mentor and a friend. And so here I am today. I mean, in 2019, I retired from the university and I moved back to the Bay Area, and I thought I was retiring. And then the pandemic happened and QAnon and anti-vaxxers. And suddenly my
Right.
phone and my email was just bursting, and I haven't stopped since. So I've been
I was
swept by
wondering,
the
yeah.
cultiverse.
Yeah, I was wondering about that because I kept reading that you were retired, and I was like, she doesn't seem very retired.
No, I'm not very retired. In fact, I'm exhausted. I'm tired, but not retired.
Right, there you go. If retired means tired again, then
Yeah,
yes.
exactly.
Yes.
Oh,
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing that story. It's so great to hear it direct from you. And of course, there's always new details that emerge. And one of the things that's intriguing to me about your story is that the organization that you were involved in did have a leader, and it was a female leader, which isn't as common.
right.
And the organization that I am no longer involved in, I was involved in more than one culty organization over the years, but the one that I worked in the inner circle of is still led by a woman who, when you've described certain aspects of your experience with your leader, they just seem to have an awful lot in common. And I think it's just worth noting because when we hear and see these, like, especially sensationalized stories about cults, it's usually some charismatic man who's got, a harem. And there's
Right.
sort of this particular trope, which obviously you and I know there's a lot of variations that don't necessarily get covered, but we don't see a lot about female-led cults and how that can show up. And so that's really an intriguing piece for me. Like, do you see that? Is it true? Is it just what I'm seeing in terms of what's depicted? Is it less common that there's a woman sort of at the helm?
Yeah,
Or
I mean, I think, probably at least 2/3 or more of cult leaders are male.
Mhm,
And I think in part it's the way men are raised. Men tend to be more assertive, more aggressive,
mhm.
um, have narcissistic tendencies, whatever, are in most of our societies still today, men are considered superior. And so I think that kind of just lends to them becoming cult leaders. There
Yeah.
certainly are, and there always have been women cult leaders, and they haven't gotten as much attention. I think in part because, in the early years, those groups weren't as sensational as the groups
Mhm.
led by men. But that I think that has certainly changed. So even most recently, we've seen, I don't know if most people have probably heard the podcast or seen the video, the documentary about Teal Swan,
Yes.
and also Love Has Won and Lula Rich,
Lula Rich. Yeah.
yeah. So I think people are getting used to the ideas like, oh yeah, women can do this too. I
Yeah.
mean, narcissism holds no bounds, it's
Yeah, for sure.
opportunity, personality disorder. So
Yeah. So true. So, in my experience, it took me, and I imagine this is fairly common as well, it took me so many years to really even recognize that what I experienced was sort of a cultic dynamic and that I had been. I imagine, I mean, it's like when we're in a cult, we think, oh, it's not a cult, right?
right, of
but
course.
but even coming out of it, and because so much of what I had seen until recent years in terms of depictions of cult were these extreme sensationalized stories, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
And it's not until recent years that I'm seeing these more nuanced portrayals and seeing, like, I know Nexium got pretty, Keith Raniere was diabolical and it got pretty gnarly. And the doorway in was very much like what I experienced, a personal development company, very much the indoctrination around being at cause and looking at your own stuff and everything circling back to personal ownership and never
Hmm.
holding the leaders accountable, all of that. It was more subtle, perhaps because I was in it, but also because there wasn't this crazy plot twist at the end. It was just this slow erosion of personal power over time. And when I got out, I didn't even realize the impact that it had had until I began working with a therapist again years later. And she actually asked me the question of, have you ever examined your spiritual wounds?
Mm.
And when she said that phrase, it just cut deep because I felt like I had lost my ability to even trust myself, right?
Sure.
That moral injury that gets spoken about. And I feel like I'm kind of going way ahead of where I wanted to go, but I want to say this right out of the gate because I think what I'm so curious to talk with you about is just the ways that these dynamics are present all around us all the time and in these self-help and personal growth containers. I've worked as a coach for 16 years and I feel like I'm walking on eggshells around this stuff all the time. Like, did I inadvertently slip into a certain kind of behavior that's maybe, reinforcing these dynamics and pulling myself back? And it's such a subtle thing. And I just am so curious to talk with you because I feel like I've seen you interviewed about these extreme situations so much. I'm so curious, what are your thoughts, especially in the culture being what it is right now? And like you said, suddenly your phone's ringing off the hook because there's a pandemic. Like, why is that? And what makes this emergence of cult dynamics so present right now? And how is it showing up in these subtle ways that maybe we don't have our eyes open to because we're just looking for these extreme examples? What are your thoughts on all that?
Well, a couple of things, because you touched on a lot. First of all, it started back in the 60s and 70s with the human potential movement, which now has evolved into this kind of personal development stuff. But the human potential movement and the therapies that were being experimented with and the stuff that was going on at Esalen out in California and the beginnings of what was known as attack therapy, there would be these groups of people who would get together supposedly under the guise of we're going to be more aware of other cultures and other ethnicities, but they really kind of turned into these kind of attack everybody situations. That then evolved into what started with what we call the large group awareness trainings, right? So EST and Landmark and Psy World and Avatar, there's just a jillion of them at this point. So all of that stuff, along with all of the new age stuff that I consider things like talking to ascended masters and seances and crystals and all that stuff. I mean, we had TV shows where, there were ghosts and it was all became completely normalized, right? It just was, all of it seeped into mainstream society and seemed to be acceptable. Then it all got into the business world with all these training programs, right? So you have entities as high as the government sending their people to these courses where they had to like hang on ropes and do whatever and be tied to each other, some really extreme situations.
Wow.
But it was all like, oh, well, this is what we were sent to do this by our company. We have to do it. We can't say no, right? And if you talked against it, you were ostracized at work. And so there was that pressure. So we have this society that's completely enmeshed in this sort of quick fix, magical thinking, right? And the acceptance of the idea of gurus or people who know better than we do, right? And that started because in the 60s, we changed the immigration laws. And up until then, it was very difficult for Asians to get into our country because of the war. So in the 60s, when we had a more liberal government, that law changed and in came the Indian gurus, right? So all these bloody gurus who left India because they weren't accepted there and they were known as charlatans for the most part, come here. And people, because of all this new age influence about how we're supposed to hate Western medicine and, all of that, the age of Aquarius. So suddenly everybody's latching on to these Indian gurus when they don't understand a shred about the Indian tradition of guruism or tantra or whatever it is, right? So they're just being taken advantage of wholesale. So all that together brings us to where we are today, right? We've got it in so many. Oh, and then of course the multi-level marketing people who use the same techniques as the LGATs did, the large group awareness trainings. You're in this ballroom and they use these high arousal techniques and they get everybody pumped up. And then you know what I'm talking about. And I'm sure most of your listeners do, right? So this is where we are. It's like, it's in our blood right now, so to speak. And so it is everywhere. And then with the pandemic, became the heightened presence of conspiracy theories. And so that's now a whole nother wing of this. I see conspiracy theories as this era's version of magical thinking, which is what the 70s and 80s were about, right? So people are desperate, they're locked in, they're on their computer, they aren't seeing anybody. We all know what happened, and they get down these other rabbit holes where they find a like-minded community, and boom. And then, of course, we had that man who was our president for a while, and he reinforced all of the us versus them thinking, which is the hallmark of a cult, right? So we find now that people feel they have the license to act out. So there's so much violence, so many shootings, people being assaulted because they're wearing a mask, whatever it is. So this kind of culty closed-mindedness is just around us all the time. And it's frightening in a way, and it's obviously harmful. I mean, some of it, I suppose, is more benign, but it's tough. And I mean, I could work 24 hours a day if I had the stamina. Just the amount of calls and queries that I get of every sort. And from every type of person, and from countries around the world.
It's like an aspect of the human condition, especially right now in this time of vulnerability. Is that vulnerability susceptibility in a way? Like when we're more vulnerable, we're more available to these influences. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
So one of the questions that I have is, I think, just a common question that was asked to me, and I was like, Janja's gonna be able to answer this much better than I can. Like, what determines the difference between a community of people and a society of people living together and a cult? What is it that pushes it over the edge what is it that makes it a cult? How would you define it?
Well, what makes something a cult is an authoritarian leader, a lack of transparency, a lack of democracy, no independent thinking, at least about anything substantial, no way to raise criticism, especially of the leader or the leadership, having a belief system that is basically an all or nothing belief system. It is the only way, and not even wanting to recognize that there could possibly even be other belief systems, and expecting you to then devote your entire life to whatever, quote, salvation or promise that this great leader is offering you. So, a community, some kind of intentional community, or just a bunch of people living together, that doesn't have to turn cultic. And it probably, in most cases, it doesn't. It's only if you get somebody like Larry Ray in there, if people are familiar with the Sarah Lawrence cult. These were just college kids living together until daddy moved in, and boom, it became really one of the most evil situations of the last few years. I didn't think anyone could be worse than Keith Raniere, but Larry Ray beat him to it.
Wow.
So I think it's important when people are thinking about joining something or signing up for something that they, consider these things, ask a lot of questions. And if your questions get turned back on you, well, that's not a good sign. Ask how the leader was chosen, ask how decisions are made, ask where the money goes. And if they tell you, well, you don't know enough yet to ask that question, then leave. Because if they're not answering your questions, that's a red flag, right?
Right.
I was talking to a woman the other day who said she went to some retreat, and when the guy they went to see walked in, everybody had to get down on the ground and bow down to him like he was God. And she said right then and there, she was like, no, I'm not doing this, right?
Right.
So try to keep your wits about you as much as you can, especially in the beginning, before you get too swept up. And slow down. People need to slow down, you know. And if they make you sign a waiver that says they're not responsible, well, that right there tells you something, because why would they make you sign a waiver unless something bad's going to happen, right?
Right. Yeah.
And a lot of the training programs now make you do that because they've been sued so often, because people have been hurt or damaged or died or whatever. So signing a non-disclosure or some kind of waiver of responsibility, don't do it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's part of doing research about
the organization you're getting involved with as well, right? If they're discouraging that, that's another red flag.
Exactly.
Or they're saying, oh, those are the sort of non-believers.
They're just bad-mouthing us. Yeah.
Yeah. They're just not as enlightened as we are, sort of the vein of where the communities that I was involved in would come from. And I think what makes it so tricky in New Age wellness circles, like where I was involved, is this sort of rhetoric around abandoning your ego, right?
Yeah.
It's like your ego is sort of the enemy, which is basically like disidentify with who you really are and defer to our authority. And that was something I was hugely vulnerable to in my late 20s and early 30s when I was really involved in all of this. And even to this day, to a certain extent, there's so many different ways they spin that, like get out of your head, right? Don't overthink things.
Don't overthink it. I was just going to say that's right.
It's so common. And I get that a lot because I have a lot of wheels spinning up here. And it's taken me years to actually celebrate that about myself. I have an intellect that's firing on all cylinders, and I've been told to like deaden that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. It's really big red flag now for me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's so much of that. And it's and it's actually such hypocritical bullshit, this whole abandon your ego, because essentially a lot of those programs or groups or whatever are all about ego and self and self-indulgence, right? And not doing a bloody thing about society, where you're supposed to feel really good about yourself because you're meditating as though that's going to do something good for the world. Not that I'm against meditation, but putting that spin on it is just ridiculous.
Yeah. I'm interested too. You mentioned in one of the interviews I heard I think you might have mentioned it to Sarah Edmondson in the conversation, because as she was coming out of NXIVM, she was sort of fighting and involved in all this activity that she maybe wouldn't have chosen if she could have authored it herself. And she became an activist, like right out of the gate. And you said something to her about her savior complex. And just being mindful of that. And I was just like, ding, ding, ding. That's something that I definitely, over the course of my life, not even just in this project, but over and over again, in some ways it was the hook for me that brought me into a lot of these containers, because, this is the next best thing that's going to save the world and change lives. Sure. And this savior complex thing really spoke to me. So can you say a little bit more about that?
Sure. So first of all, I think it in part stems from the fact that despite all the myths about who joins cults, like stupid, weird, crazy, lazy people, in my 35 years of doing this, I think I can firmly say that if there's a common denominator among the people who join cults, it's idealism, right? It's people who want to better the world, better themselves, better their family, find perfect enlightenment, if you will, financial success, but it's some form of idealism. And 9 times out of 10, it's about the world and not just about yourself, right?
Yeah.
So people get into things because of their good intentions, and then they spend whatever amount of time in this organization thinking that whatever they're being told to do is because they're saving the world, right? Ultimately. So when they get out, 2 things happen. They're still left with that feeling of, I want to change the world, save the world. But now it sort of focuses back on all those people who are still left in the group. And I want to help get them all out. I want them to see what I'm seeing, right? Or I want to expose the group and tell the authorities or whatever. And so it's kind of this leftover feeling, and also the need to have a purpose, right? While we're in these groups, we think we have a purpose, and there's nothing wrong with that. We all want purpose in our life and meaning. So then we get out and there's this huge void.
Yeah,
right?
for sure.
So this is going to give you purpose again, right? If you're either going to go back and save everybody or whatever, or you're going to start a podcast and tell the world, or you're going to whatever.
Guilty.
Whatever way you're going to do it. Exactly. And my caution to people is that if you become, and I see this as activism, but if you become an activist too soon after leaving a cultic situation, it's going to come back to bite you. You're either going to crash at some point and be overwhelmed and triggered, or you're going to do things that aren't helpful because you yourself aren't recovered enough yet.
Yeah.
So you might end up even damaging further certain relationships or whatever it might be, right?
Yeah.
People want to be in documentaries. Let's get a documentary about our group. And then they have to spend all this time on camera talking about it with a room full of audio guys and camera guys and, all these strangers, and they get triggered like crazy.
Sure.
And it's a huge setback. So it's really important. Not that I have anything against activism. I mean, obviously that's what I've done.
Right.
But I think people have to really initially focus on themselves. And that's really hard to do because typically we've been in groups where we're told not to focus on ourselves, right? Like
Exactly.
a ego, right? It's not about you, right? So you think now if you do, quote, self-care, that you're being selfish, right? Or I remember the first few months, like sitting down and making a bowl of popcorn and watching a football game. And one part of me was like, oh, I'm just doing this incredibly normal thing. And the other part of me was like, I should be doing something. I should be working. I should be doing something. Always in the back of my head, I'm being lazy. I'm being, and I'm sure you and many others experienced that. So it's important to really do your recovery in whatever way that is for you. And every person's path is different, but otherwise it's going to potentially harm you and potentially harm the people you're trying to save. And I know it's difficult. I know it's hard to find therapists who understand this. I know there aren't that many resources available. I went through the same thing. And so I know it's hard. I hear it day and night from Canada, Europe, wherever. There aren't therapists who get it. They can't find people to talk to understand. And then their friends are telling them, oh, just get over it already. Just get over it, right?
Yeah.
It's like, no, you don't just get over it. These are incredibly traumatic experiences. So that's my bit on the savior complex.
Yeah, that's great. That's really great. And I think it relates to an overarching theme in my life. Because I think, my first cult was my nuclear family. There was a patriarchal leader that called all the shots and we were all just walking on eggshells. So I feel like my indoctrination started when I was like 4 years old when my mom remarried. So I see that for many, many years, my desire to heal was just completely projected onto people all around me. Like I was the wounded healer running around trying to do all the things for everyone else. And it took me a long time to really be in recovery. Right. And I'm still in it. And I just want to say for listeners out there who are hearing what you're saying about, the challenges, I'm going to plug your book like crazy because it's such a great resource in terms of the process of healing and having that language. And then you even have a place, I can't remember what chapter it's in, but a list of questions for a therapist. If you're going to see a therapist, like the right questions to ask to make sure that they're informed in the right ways and that they don't re-trigger and re-traumatize you, which can happen a lot.
Yes.
Yeah, for sure. Especially right now, I'm living 20 minutes outside of Sedona, which just circumstantially, that's where my mother-in-law is. And it's like, thankfully I'm where I am so that I'm not triggered just walking around town.
I remember when I went to Sedona, it was actually, I was working on the Gabriel stuff then. Gabriel Sedona, who's, I don't know what his name is now, but I was working with several families who had adult children in Gabriel, and a couple of them were fighting for custody of their grandchildren because they didn't want them raised there. And so my partner and I went to Sedona for like a long weekend, and I was just like, oh my God, this is
it's like over the top.
New age culty heaven,
it really is.
Burn,
It really is. Yeah, it so is. Yeah, it's interesting. Just side note on that, I was hiking just a few weeks ago, and I realized that I was on a trail that I had read about. So are you familiar with Danach? It's Dahnhak. It's a cult that I was involved in. They had centers all over the States, and it was basically, they called it brain yoga. It was like a lot of Tai Chi, meridian exercises, some really beneficial body practices. And when I went into the center, I started taking the classes, and they immediately start love bombing like crazy. And I and my partner at the time, we were both sort of chosen to be invited to their healer school, which was this $10,000 investment.
Wow.
And there was a lot of pressure to quote unquote manifest this money, which neither of us had access to any kind of cash like that. And so we would do these 4 a.m. bowing exercises and just all these practices to manifest this money. And it was really high pressure sales and something that I've come to call soft power coercion. What I've experienced in the new age wellness spheres, and even working as a coach and being trained to create online sales funnels and be like a celebrity coach and all that stuff, which I could never get behind. This different way of coercing people, like just loving them so much that they can't possibly say no to you.
Oh, yeah.
Right? It's so common. And I just, when I hear the word coercion, I don't hear as much conversation about how, especially how much this is being used in the self-help commercialized arenas, how we're literally trained. I've gone through so many online business trainings as a coach and working in personal development. You're literally trained to do this. They don't call it love bombing,
right?
But it's essentially what you're doing. You find the pain point and then you activate it. You put a timeline around how quickly they need to sign up. And then you're just loving at them the whole time until they finally say yes. It's so icky. It's always felt just so gross to me. And that's why I backed away from the whole arena of self-help. And I went back to school and got my master's in social impact. I was like, there's got to be a better way to help people than this. This does not feel good. I'm not even sure what my question is, but it'd be interesting to hear your take on how recruitment happens in this sort of what I call soft power coercion, like how that gets manipulated too. Like have you seen that in your work a lot?
Yeah, I mean, that's what it is, right? I mean, the problem is, like you said, I think people think of coercion as somebody holding a gun to your head, but that's not what coercion is. I mean, coercion is way more subtle than that. And that's what we need to get the courts and law enforcement to understand, as they've been doing in some countries now, like in the UK and in, I think, New Zealand and Australia and Scotland. It's now in the books. Mostly it's being applied to domestic situations and not quite yet cults or other high control groups. But I get these situations all the time, whereas, I'm working with some husband whose wife has just given $500,000 to some bogus energy worker up in Idaho. And he calls the police and they say, well, she's in her 40s. If she wants to give him all her money, that's her decision.
Right. Yeah.
And he's like, first of all, it's my money, but
there's that.
But they don't get that people can be swayed in these sometimes obvious, but often way more subtle ways. And the more you're invested in something, and the more you've bought into it, then the harder and harder it is. And the easier it is for them to push you on to the next thing and the next thing. And I see that all the time. So it's sometimes more obvious, like at a gathering where we did this in my cult. We'd have these dinners for workers, right? Because we were supposed to be recruiting the workers. And we'd have like Thanksgiving open house and we'd have 50 turkeys, right? And and of course, none of us were supposed to say we were part of this political organization. And then, maybe 5 workers would come, so each one could have a turkey. But then if somebody arrived, it's just like that person, you just swarm around that person and say whatever you can to make them feel so wonderful and so loved, so that when you say, oh, come on back, they just feel they feel obligated to say yes. I don't know if you've read Robert Cialdini, but his book is genius. It's just called Influence. And he's the social psychologist. Actually, he's probably retired now, but he was at University of Arizona. And he talks about these principles. I think there's 9 principles of influence, and one of them is reciprocation, right? Like they do something for you. And so you feel like you do something for them.
Oh, gosh. Yeah, that really resonates.
He tells this story in the book. The book is great. It was one of the first books I got way back in the 90s. But anyway, he tells this story about one time one of his experiments was that he just went through the phone book and he randomly sent Christmas cards to various families, various homes. And I forget what percentage, but a remarkable percentage sent him back a Christmas card, thinking they must know who this guy is, and so they should send a Christmas card back. It's just like a perfect example of that reciprocation, right? So, this is, basic human behavior that's just being very smartly manipulated by these con artists. And if you take it down to the bare bones, that's what it is. They're all charlatans. And it's all about money, sex, or power, it's whatever it's at.
Yeah. Do you think that, has it been your experience that people who have, I would say like most of us on some level have a small t trauma in our background, but people who have more of a trauma history are more likely to be exploited in terms of these dynamics? Have you seen that have you found that to be the case at all?
Yeah, I think there is a lot of that. On the one hand, I truly believe, and I say all the time, that anybody can get recruited into something or some kind of cultic situation, because all it takes is running into someone at that vulnerable moment. And we're all vulnerable thousands of times in our lives. That's not an illness. That's not a weakness. It's raining today, so I'm vulnerable, right? Or I have an ant invasion, so I'm vulnerable. Right? It can be anything. I just moved to a new town. I just got divorced. My dog just died, but whatever. And so if in that moment, no matter what your background, I think you can be susceptible to that lure. Now, of course, the pitch has to resonate with you. It can't be something way out of left field that you would never relate to, right? So I always say, I would never join a meditation cult because I can't sit still that long, right? But a political cult, I'm going to change the world. Oh yeah, I can do that, right? So that sounded good to me, right? So there has to be that. But I do think just from all the people I've met over the years, this, hundreds and hundreds of survivors at this point, if not more, and plus the courses I've been doing, there are a lot of people with narcissistic families in their backgrounds, or a pattern of getting into narcissistic relationships, romantic relationships, or maybe even with bosses, one boss after another, and people who do what we call cult hopping, go from cult to cult because they don't get the right psychoeducation or recovery work in between. So they don't assess what happened to me and why, and how can I not let this happen again? I think childhood trauma for sure. But, to tell you the truth, I've hardly met anyone who doesn't have some kind of trauma background.
As soon as they started asking the question, I was like, well.
Who is that? And I think, right now, like narcissism is really trendy. And I think a lot of that came because of that guy who was our president for a while. And people finally knew what that term meant and started talking about it. And so then there started being more awareness of it, and people being in relationships with narcissists or their family or whatever, when it wasn't really talked about before. And so people started reading the books, and maybe it's used a little too much today because people tend to jump on bandwagons,
Yeah, for sure.
But I think it's good that there's attention coming to that, because there's a lot to know about narcissists and how they operate and the different types of narcissists, and the reality that they don't change. They're not going to change. So you're beating your head against the wall if you think you're going to change that guy or that woman or that sister or whoever. And so I think it's important people get educated about that. And certainly the cult leaders, most of them are what we call malignant narcissists, which means there's a bit of psychopathy or sociopathy, and that's when things get really ugly, like with Keith Raniere or Larry Ray, or, some of the really more vile cult leaders.
Yeah. It's interesting, as I put out this project, and I did my best to tell my story in terms of all these different ways that I experienced cult dynamics in my life. And I focused primarily on this organization that I call the org that I was involved in the inner circle and got the most, I suppose, wounded by. And then I interviewed another woman who came out, and we've had conversations, and it's since been circulating among this community, because the organization still exists and there's lots of people who are still in it. And it's circulating pretty widely. And the people who need to know who we're talking about absolutely do. And I've also heard from more than one person that, of course, there's people in the inner circle now who have every intention of addressing this stuff, even hearing from the people who say, I'm learning from what you're sharing and we're going to change this. And Right. And have you ever seen that happen? Like,
No, no, because of one thing of what I said, which is narcissists don't change. You can't
yeah,
change them. There's something wrong with their brain. They're not like us. They don't think
yeah,
like us, and that's what's hard for people to accept.
yeah.
That people can really be that way. Especially the really evil ones. But in a sense, that happened in my group. So in my group, the cult leader split with her second in command, which was a big mistake because the second in command is really who ran everything and who knew everybody inside out and who was very effective in her way of working with you and talking to you or criticizing you. And she trained me. The leader was brutish, drunk, vindictive, hard to be around, threw tantrums. And so, we often did our best to just keep her away from most of the members. And most members had no clue what she was like. And some had never even seen her
Right.
once we got big enough, right? So she broke with her second in command, which was really stupid. And she basically banished her to her house and no one was supposed to see her and all of that. Well, her name was Rosa, while she was in confinement, she started reading books and she started reading about adult children of alcoholics, which she was one.
Mm-hmm.
And she started putting some shit together. And then she secretly started talking to some of us and saying, hey, I think we've got a problem here, blah, blah, blah. And so it kind of opened up this can of worms that suddenly we were talking about stuff which we never, ever, ever had been allowed to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, the leader started to go to therapy because we were working her so hard, right? And of course, none of us could ever go to therapy. I mean, that was like, no, no, no. But she started going to therapy so she could complain about us all the time. And she came back, and at one of the inner circle meetings one day, she said, I think we have to have quality of life circles or, some bullshit name like that. And we need to get all the branches. That's what we called our meeting groups. Get all our branches together and people should talk about their quality of life. And those of us in leadership were like, oh my God, she doesn't have a clue what she's doing. This is going to blow the whole thing wide open, right?
Yeah.
And basically it did. It didn't happen exactly like that, but that's the point at which she left the country. And enough of us had been talking, and enough of us who were like the people who had been in almost the whole time. Like one of my colleagues and I, we were about to go to Frankfurt to the book fair because we ran the publishing house. And we got on the plane at 5 a.m. And as soon as the door shut, we looked at each other and said, we're in a cult. And we spent the whole time in Frankfurt crying and eating Frankfurters and drinking big things of beer and looking for jobs. And meanwhile, the same thing happened back home. Everybody just blew. It was just spontaneous.
Interesting.
So this idea that these people in leadership are saying, oh, we hear what people are saying and we're going to talk about it.
Yeah.
It could lead to an internal volcano. It may not. This is what happened in the Hare Krishnas, where all the child abuse started coming out, that the children were sent to these gurukulas, the schools in India, and there was horrific sexual and physical abuse. Years later, they filed a class action lawsuit against the Hare Krishnas. And it was a huge to-do. And at that time, Prabhupada was already dead. So there were like these 10 guys who were left in charge, 10 or 12. And some of them said, we should expose this. And half of them said, no, we shouldn't. But it started a whole kerfuffle. And I don't know where this word kerfuffle comes from, but everybody's using it lately.
I like it. I haven't used it, but I'm going to start.
Yeah, I know. It's like, and so anyway, this huge kerfuffle happened and it exposed a lot. And they did change some things. There were some dynamics were changed within the Hare Krishnas. It's still not the healthiest of organizations, but so some of these things do have kind of a ripple effect. But in most cases, I'd say the cult leader is going to clamp down and a couple of people probably get expelled and things will carry on. I would certainly never put all my hopes in that basket,
Yeah. Yeah. I've made the decision not to become involved in that conversation. Been invited into it, and I don't feel like that would serve me.
Yeah.
And one of the
Good
things that I feel,
self-care. Yay.
yeah. Well, and I feel like the centering of the leader and the organization is the problem
Yeah.
for me. And I'm done with that. I'm going to pay attention to myself and connect with the people who, want to connect around our experience. Like you said, sharing, whether it's with a Frankfurter and a beer or whatever it is, like, let's unpack this together and connect with people like you who are doing this work. And I feel like that in some ways, the need to save the organization is really just another symptom of the indoctrination. Cause I look at it now, 16 years later, and I'm like, it's just another mind body fitness practice, like whatever. It's not the end all be all. It's not this thing that we need to save because it's going to save the world. And oh my gosh, we have to make it work. Right. I think that being invited to have those conversations, I just feel like, no, it's just not useful for me. And I'm done with the self-sacrificing storyline that I need to, save everyone
Right.
from this internal monster that nobody's willing to really deal with.
Right. I mean, we did the same when we broke up. Like I said, all of us were out, and then these debates started, and we kind of scattered around the country. And this was pre-internet, so we'd write these documents and make copies and mail them all around it. And this whole debate started about, well, was it worth it? Was any of it worth it? And I've just been rereading my journals because I'm writing a memoir, and
cool
journal, and I'm saying, no, it wasn't worth it. God damn it. And I don't want to be part of these discussions. I don't have time for I'm not going to talk about was it worth it. It hurt people. It hurt a lot of people very badly. And that's all that really matters,
Yes.
So that's such a natural tendency to cling to it, to not let it go anyway. Yeah. I wanted to make sure you know Laura Tucker.
The name is familiar. Remind me who she is.
She has a podcast called Free Your Inner Guru.
Yes. I watched her interview with you. Yeah. Yeah.
Because she's, she was a coach as well. And so I think you'd have a lot to
I've been thinking of reaching out to her. Yeah.
You should. Let her know you talked to me. And, we still follow each other on Instagram and stuff. I love her. She's one of my favorite people. Yeah.
Great. Yeah. I'll definitely reach out to her.
I always remember her podcast because that was my famous line of there are no gurus.
Yes.
That's become my mantra.
Yeah. Honestly, that's been so key for me. And even in the years since I've been out of the org, getting close to it's like a moth to a flame. I catch myself and then I'm like, what are you doing? Right. Mm-hmm. and really that's my thing has been nobody has spiritual authority.
Right.
That lives inside of me. Like I've had to find that and stay connected to that. And sometimes I have to reel myself back. There I go again. Right.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things I wanted to ask you was a question that I actually had from this small support group that myself and Tracy, who was featured on my podcast, we started for people who have left the org, that has been mind-blowing, the stories that people are sharing in some ways. And maybe this is also common, not even realizing how bad it was until you start hearing other people's stories. And I left 16 years ago and did a lot of work and yet remained silent the whole time because of all the good that the organization does on the fringe, right? I know you've spoken a lot about, you call them LGATs, the large group awareness trainings. Mm-hmm. Our organization there were like belt levels, right? They'd be anywhere between 10 to 50 people, depending on the level. And it was a very specific kind of atmosphere. They were called intensives, and they were most certainly intense. And one of the women said that she had a lot of peak experiences in these environments. And that even now, as she's woken up to these dynamics and wants nothing to do with the organization, she finds herself missing that high, that altered state. And she's wondering, along with many of us, like what to do with that misguided longing when you're steeped in New Age wellness and that becomes the norm, even the meditative practices, all the different things. And if you could explain a little bit what's happening there in terms of those high arousal experiences, and maybe if we understand a little bit more what's going on, there can be a letting go of nostalgia around that. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense? Yeah. Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts?
Have you ever dropped acid?
I haven't dropped acid, but I did get slipped something at a concert and I was hallucinating and I went to the hospital. And so I've been in a very, very altered state before. Yeah.
Okay. So basically what happens in those intensives or in the darshans that Rajneesh used to do, and in the LGATs, in these generally mass situations with a lot of input, a lot, maybe loud music, maybe drumming, maybe whatever, somebody talking endlessly, whatever the intensity is, people go into a kind of an altered state, a form of trance, and the high arousal part of it triggers brain reactions. And it's basically your brain reactions that are setting off these, what you interpret as a peak experience. So for me, it would have been an LSD high, right? I saw the Beatles marching through my living room. I swore they were there, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah,
nobody's
for
going to tell me the Beatles, Sgt. Pepper's band didn't walk through my living room, right? So it's the same thing. It's that you attribute whatever happens to you in that state to whoever got you there. And so in these cases, it's the coaches who got you there, or it's Rajneesh who got you there, but they didn't get you there. It's your own bloody brain that got you there.
Right.
So those are actually your personal experiences that your brain set off and reacted to the intensity of all of the things that were happening around you. Right. And so they will be different for each person because every person's brain is different and what's packed in there with everything else and what traumas and whatever. So whatever these experiences feel like, whether it's sometimes it's frightening, sometimes it's a past life experience, sometimes it's like a spiritual awakening, sometimes somebody thinks they're Jesus, and then they become a cult leader, right? But it's all of your own doing in that sense. It's mechanistically or physically your brain doing that. And it was set off by everything that was turned on around you.
Right.
Right. So anybody can make that happen to you. Some people are better at putting together the logistics of that than others and creating an atmosphere of wonder and awe and being like super cosmic, like Rajneesh with his funny little voice and, sucking on his laughing gas and touching their foreheads and having people screaming and shaking, right?
Yeah.
And so, or people are lying on the floor. In a lot of large group awareness trainings, people are like rolling on the floor, or there's rebirthing, there's, whatever they want to call it in whatever program. It's essentially that same thing. It's getting you into an altered state. And it's really not anything special that they've done or that they can do. It's just that they learn the technique and they're taking advantage of it and they're making fame and fortune off of it.
Right.
So, and that's why people go back. I mean, that's why they go back, because they feel high, and then in a few days it wears off. So they want to go back and feel that again.
Exactly. Yeah.
It is.
So addictive. In our instance, it was euphoric dance.
Okay, right? There you go.
Euphoric dance practice. And in some ways, some of it was just physiological, like enough endorphins flowing through your body, you're going to get loopy, right? And you just happen to be around a bunch of other people who are, which just heightens the experience.
Yeah. I mean, that's what Rajneesh, he had them doing that who meditation where they would jump and go who for hours. People would go into seizures and stuff because your body can't really take that. But you've got 500 people in a room doing that. You don't notice the one guy who's falling on the floor in an epileptic seizure.
Yeah. Well, and there's a lot of talk in our group about just dissociative experiences and how often we were dissociating. And that just became actually confused with a positive meditative altered state.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
And all this false sense, this false sense of power and ability. Like one of the LGATs got sued because their thing was to make you do your worst fear. Right? Like go and do your worst fear. And so there was a guy who couldn't swim and he decided he was going to jump in the lake and swim. And he drowned and he died. And his parents sued because he was manipulated into doing that. There's no way under any other circumstances he would have jumped in the lake. Right. But they set out these false ideals, and push people towards them. And that's where it can get really dangerous.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And in Danak, when I was involved in that, we would do this practice called Yandan, and we would stand in a room And they would put us in like a kind of intense yoga posture, like a really deep stance with our arms up high. And they would play like this intense drumming music. And we were to hold the posture for 30 to 40 minutes. And the body would shake and sweat. And they would walk through and say over and over again, my body is not me, but mine. My mind is not me, but mine. And it was this sort of breaking down, this like listening to those signals. And I didn't know, of course, where it was headed. And I wasn't able to manifest the $10,000 for the healer training. And I did eventually, I transferred, thankfully, to a different center where their high pressure sales was a little more overt and transparent. And I just finally said, no, I'm turning my back on this. I was so proud of myself. And then I turned right into another cult.
You and millions of others.
Right, yeah. So, but when I left, years later, I learned about a woman by the name of Julia Seiverls, who was involved with Zanuck and did go through the program that I was thinking of going through. And she actually died on a hike on a trail in Sedona, a hike that they had everyone go on this hike in July in Sedona at 9 a.m. with a backpack full of rocks.
Oh my God.
And very minimal water. And she, of course, this mind over matter thing.
Yeah.
That could have been me. I mean, I was on the track of overriding. I would hold the posture for 35 minutes, Janja. Like my body would be screaming at me and I would do it. And I thought it was connecting me to my true self.
Right.
Right. And I'm interested, you speak about in the book, I can't remember if it's Take Back Your Life or Escaping Utopia, which I also love. You talk about, what is the word you say? Doubling?
Oh, doubling. Yeah, that's a term that, I don't know if that came from Lifton. I don't remember. Basically, it's this idea that you kind of have your real self and your cult self, not in the sense of, what we used to think of as split personalities, but there is the persona who is trained in the ways of the cult, who can and will do things that the other you never would have done or wouldn't even try to do or couldn't do. Right. And that's kind of the clash. I think that's part of the cognitive dissonance that goes on with people, because you've probably heard me say this. My feeling is that everybody has doubts. I was way up there and I had doubts.
Yeah. Same.
And everybody has doubts, but you can't express them. And once you're indoctrinated enough, you berate yourself for having those doubts, right?
100%. Yeah.
But the doubts don't go completely away. They go and they sit on a shelf in the back of your head, right? This is my shelf metaphor.
I love this. Keep going.
And then when enough things happen that get loaded on that shelf, right? At some point that shelf breaks. And that's the cognitive dissonance. It's that the reality you're living in doesn't match the reality of the real world, or the reality that is different. And so it creates this very uncomfortable mental conflict, really. It's an uncomfortable space. And some people will consistently choose for their belief system. They can't let go of their belief system, right? And that's what Festinger talked about. He's the guy who kind of conceptualized cognitive dissonance with this UFO cult that he studied. But, the little shelf breaking kind of lets you know there's something not right here. And you may not think it's a cult. You may not escape at that moment, but it gets the wheels turning. It just opens up a crack that you start to entertain the idea that maybe this isn't healthy for me.
Yeah.
Maybe I need to check out other things. Maybe I need to, and then that dilemma has to work itself out, which can happen in different ways and can take a long time or a short time, depending on the person's experience and the situation they're in and all of that. But so I think we do have these different aspects of our personality. I know when I got out of my cult, I was like, how in the hell did I become that person?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's not that I didn't know who I was in a sense. I certainly knew that I had been changed, but I was like, how did I get changed to that degree? And where did that come from? And was that in me, or did they create, was that like a recipe they put together? And
right.
that was all the stuff I had to figure out.
Yeah.
And in part, I did that by calling old friends and relatives and it's like, who was I before? And what was I like as a kid? What was I like as your college roommate? Just to like do these different reality checks.
That's great. Yeah, that's a great tool. I love that.
So
but
this stuff is so complex.
It is. And I feel like I've been kicking against this spiritual persona for 2 decades now. I'm like, who am I if I'm not all the things I was taught to be that make me the ideal superhuman?
Oh dear.
Now granted, I didn't think of it that way at all. It was my insecurity that in some ways, I feel like the circles I got pulled into really preyed on the fact that I already felt that I was deficient and that I wasn't enough. And so if they can give me the formula to fix that, and I can continually be fighting against myself, who's not enough, to be all those things. And it is, I mean, that doubling thing really spoke to me. And I feel like only in recent years am I even landing back into myself and even catching myself when that kicks in. It's almost like it's like a socialized thing. It's like this reflex to be, and it's beyond the cold experience, right? It's the good girl, it's the patriarchy, it's all the things, right? It's like, I mean, we're just kicking against the current in a lot of ways, but I definitely resonated with that sense of doubling and feeling that division and finding integration again has been such a process.
And the integration isn't going to be who you were back then.
Right.
I wasn't going to go back to be the person I was when I was 30, right? I was now 41 and I was probably 45 or 6 by the time I actually felt I knew who I was.
Right.
And so who I was a combination of all of that, but it's not, recovery isn't going back to who you were before because you've experienced too much and you've learned too much.
Yeah.
And that's part of if we want to think there's a positive of these experiences, it's that most of us are now so aware of how these things work.
Yeah.
And we're able to spot them quicker. We're able to help educate others and help others from prevent them from getting involved in situations like that. So the quote, the blessing, although I hate using words like that, but the blessing, yes, is, having this now human experience of one of the worst things and being able to survive it and do something with it.
Yeah. I mean, in many ways, I would say that my sense of self is stronger than it would have been otherwise. I mean, it's impossible to know, but having to really return and reclaim my inner authority has been so profound. It's almost like, and again, I'm not saying everything happens for a reason. I hate that shit. But like this whole idea of sometimes it's like that pendulum, right? It's like sometimes we have to swing on that pendulum to find the center. And I feel like that's what this has been for me in a lot of ways. Yeah, for sure.
Not that I would do it again.
Yeah, me neither. Yeah, definitely not. Right.
Yeah.
I did take many years and now I'm self-expressing about these experiences. And really, for me, it was more of a creative than educational project. It was more just, I need to bring what I now know from the inside out. And it just happens to be that I have a podcast and I get to share it with other people. And one of the questions that's come to me as we're in this circle of sharing our experiences, obviously there's a great benefit in expressing and telling our stories, right? That's pretty key. Is there like a point at which that's no longer helpful in terms of our healing journey? Like we're taking back our life, but are we spinning the story so much that we actually need to learn to separate from it? Is that like kind of where therapy comes in, or like, what are your thoughts around that?
I think it's different for each person. I think people find it helpful, especially at the beginning of their awakening moment or whatever we want to call it, right? I think they find it helpful to talk about it, to find people who understand what they're talking about, maybe support groups or whatever we want to call them, or reading stuff, reading other people's stories. And I mean, I see recovery as sort of a roller coaster where you're going to go through periods where that's all you want to do and think about. And then there are going to be times it's like, I don't want to even hear the word cult anymore. And I just want to, like, go to water world or whatever people do. Like, I just want to be life,
Right. Yeah.
So I think that there's kind of that up and down. And I think, it's different for every person. I think for some people, they're going to speak out for a while and then that was enough. And they'll go off and do their life and maybe never talk about it again, at least publicly.
Right.
Whereas other people might end up doing it for a few years or, I mean, I don't know that I intentionally did it this way, but obviously this is what I did. It's like, I mean, I certainly had years when I did less of this, but it was always some part of what I was doing, either writing a book or giving talks or whatever, teaching it in my classes. When I was teaching, I couldn't do as much because we had such a high teaching load, but that's when I wrote Escaping Utopia. That was one of my research projects. So, I think it's different for everybody. And I think some people don't ever want to speak out, and that's okay. Yeah. There's no obligation. That's something that comes up all the time in our classes is like people, they go to work and people want to know, well, what did you do for the last 10 years? And let's like, how do you talk about that? Do you start talking about it and then you start flooding and it's like, blah, and you tell the whole story and everybody looks at you like they're nuts. Or you just shut up and then you act like a weirdo. And, so like everybody has to sort through that. And, we always suggest do a lot of practice runs. If you know you're going to be a social situation, practice what you're going to say when you get asked that question.
Yeah. Especially in the beginning, it'd be so awkward and triggering, right? So it's almost better to not say anything. Yeah.
Yeah. But then if you don't say anything, then it's like, well, you're like this really silent person,
Yeah.
I just, now when people ask about like a certain band or something, I just say, that was my blackout period. I don't know about between, 75 and 85,
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So I'll just have two more questions. The first is really around your bounded choice framework, which I think is so beautiful. And before I even dove into the book, just those two words, bounded choice, because in the environments I was in, and I want to ask you this question because I know there's potentially for sure going to be some people listening to this who are still involved in the organization that I speak of and are maybe in some ways mentally out, but physically in, sort of on that fringe. And it just was so helpful to me to understand because I was in an environment, there was so much talk about personal power and choice. It was like literally the focus of one of the whole levels of training.
Right.
We were continually told how to express our personal power and that we had choice and that it was our job to sort of stand up and speak our truth when necessary. But the framework itself didn't support that. And this idea of bounded choice is really interesting to me. And I'm wondering if you could speak to it a little bit. Like,
okay.
I know it's a big framework. I know there's 4 aspects to it. So there's the charismatic authority, right? The transcendent belief system, systems of control, and systems of influence, right? So we'll let people read all about all that in your book. I don't expect you to break all that down. And the idea that we have choice, but we don't have choice. That's kind of what I would love for you to just speak to for a moment.
So for me, what bounded choice is, it's a state of mind that you get to when you have more or less internalized all of the indoctrination, right? So that you in a sense are like a little microcosm of the cult. Right? So at that point, in your mind, you cannot imagine life outside of the context of that group, because life outside the group means death, either literal or figurative, right? So for some cults, it really, people are threatened with death or their family's going to be killed or whatever, right? There's like horrible paranoia implanted into people. But it could also be figurative, in the sense that you're going to lose your chance on that path to salvation or whatever it is, right? So you cannot imagine life outside the group. You're so deep into it and it is so much a part of you. Once you get to that place, you have choices, but the choices you make are determined by the will of the leader and the will of the group. So that you have choices like inconsequential things. Now, depending on the cult, it might be where you live or the car you buy or the food you eat or the clothes, whatever. You can certainly decide that. But big decisions like, am I going to talk back to the leader? Or am I going to challenge this issue? Or am I going to speak up about that? Or am I going to think about leaving? You cannot entertain those ideas. Those are choices you don't get to make, right? So at that point, your will is completely altered by the will of the group. And so, yes, you have free will of a sort about certain things, but about other things, you really don't. Because you are so indoctrinated into it at that point, and so much of a believer and a devotee of whoever that leader is. So that's kind of what bounded choice is in a nutshell. And I wrote that book. It was my dissertation in grad school, and my question was, why do people in cults do things that those of us on the outside find incomprehensible? So it was to kind of explain that question. Why did the people in Heaven's Gate take their own lives, right? Why do mothers give away their children? Why do whatever?
Right.
Why do we do the things we're asked to do when never in our lives we would have done those things, right? So to try to answer that question. And it's because we're psychologically trapped and emotionally, of course.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. It's so helpful to hear you explain the framework. And when I first heard it, I think I'd heard somebody reference you and say those words. I actually thought of it in terms initially as, like if I leave, I lose everything. Like I'm bounded in that sense. If I leave, I no longer, and this is how it was, like I no longer have a community. I no longer have a job. I no longer have a spiritual practice. I no longer have like all of those things, but that framework is what's created that reality. Right. So it's just another way of looking at it
and that's
in terms
exactly
of
what it is.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So I did understand it. Good.
You're living in a bounded reality.
Yes. 100%.
That's what I call the self-sealing system. Everything's closed in on itself. And then you are closed in on yourself.
And that, I can't remember, maybe triple isolation. Somebody spoke about triple isolation I was reading, and they said you're isolated from the outside world, you're isolated from people within the group because you can't complain or talk about anything, and you're isolated from yourself.
Yeah.
And that just ding, ding, ding ran to all three for sure. And seeing that even now, like there's a couple of people in this group that I worked with 16 years ago, and they're sharing things that I had no idea occurred in their reality. And they probably heard my story and felt the same way. And we were close friends.
Wow.
And I had no idea. And they had no idea, right? We were taught not to communicate with each other. Yeah. It's
same thing. I mean, in our group, spouses, whoever, I mean, you didn't know where somebody else worked. You didn't know what they did. You didn't.
Oh, wow.
So relationships were just bullshit. They were based on nothing real.
Right. Yeah.
And that's why I think that happens a lot when people leave cult. A lot of couples, especially if they met in the cult, end up getting divorced when they leave because those really weren't real relationships.
Right.
In many ways.
I can see that. Yeah. So what can we do to make this type of education more mainstream? Like what? I just feel like
another question.
Yeah.
Well, I'm starting a nonprofit, and hopefully that can be one of our programs.
Yeah. Well, if there's anything I can do to support and help, I would be more than happy to, because it's just feels so important.
Yeah.
I'm
actually revising and updating Take Back Your Life. So it'll have a lot of new stories in it, personal accounts, and updating the stuff on complex CPSD. Because when the book was written, no one was even talking about complex CPSD.
Yeah.
So that's pretty exciting. And just a lot going on.
And you're writing a memoir?
Yeah, that's in the back burner. I'm trying to write a memoir in the middle of all this before I die. But anyway, if people, my website, janjalalich.com, it will always have announcements about the new nonprofit, which will eventually have its own website. But
Uh-huh. And cultresearch.org is another way
It's
to
the
get
same
to
thing. Yeah,
the
that's
same
the
site.
same
Okay.
website. Yeah.
It's easier so people don't misspell your name, right?
Yeah. Exactly.
I know how that goes. They have the same thing.
Not an easy name, I know.
That's so great. Well, Take Back Your Life and Escaping Utopia are the two books that I've read and highly recommend. And I'll stand up from my couch cushion and applaud for those few seconds you're in the vow. I was like hoping you were going to be, they were going to feature a lot of your expertise in it, but I'll still watch, although not as excitedly.
Tell them that.
I would love to. Yeah.
I'll be in plenty of other documentaries, believe me. I'm actually have a crew coming here tomorrow to do one. So,
oh, really?
Yeah.
You are just.
There'll be one coming out about Larry Ray and the Sarah Lawrence cult. I'll be in that one. But that, it usually takes a year. So
who knows how long?
Yeah. They just come out whenever they come out. So
yeah. Great. Well, it's been just such a pleasure to talk to you. And if there's any way you need people to be involved to spread the word about something, just let me know. I'd love to stay in touch with you. And thank you so much.
Wonderful. Yeah. Thanks, Candice. Glad we
you're welcome. Made it work. I know we did it.
Okay.
Take care. Bye.
Ciao.
What a rare treat to have the opportunity to sit down with someone whose work has been a key to a door you didn't even know was there. Huge, massive thanks to Janja for spending so much time with me and with us, and for her willingness to be so brave with her work and her own personal story. Now, I happen to agree with Janja that sharing our honest stories is a form of activism, especially when telling the whole truth means challenging cultural norms that condition us toward conformity, siloing us from one another, and tethering us to lofty promises that deny the complexity of our human experience. The reality is we all get lost in groupthink from time to time, whether it happens in a spiritual or self-help community, in the race to the top of a workplace hierarchy, or in the thrall of an all-consuming love affair. These dynamics can be a bit blindsiding. And when we come to on the other side of an experience, we often wonder what on earth came over us. It is in this moment when our real work begins. Sometimes it's not enough to know what happened to us. We must also understand the why and the how of it. We must take time to learn from our experiences, to go deeper than the drama, to understand mechanisms of influence. Which is why I encourage you to pick up one or more of Dr. Janja's books. I have earmarked and highlighted the hell out of my own copy of Take Back Your Life. And I also really enjoy the audio version, which is read by NXIVM survivor and brave as fuck whistleblower Sarah Edmondson. If you aren't familiar with Sarah, she's featured in the HBO docuseries The Vow, which Janja and I referenced in our chat. The second season of The Vow is set to release on October 17th. I cannot express the debt of gratitude I feel toward people who are doing work in this arena. Dr. Janja Lalich, Sarah Edmondson, Nippy Ames, my hopefully new friend Laura Tucker, and so many others who are bravely working to raise awareness and provide psychoeducation to those of us who need it most. Which, side note, I happen to believe is all of us. I'm going to keep saying it, culty culture is every damn where. So we're going to keep unpacking it, how easy it is to lose ourselves in the social pressures all around us. And on that note, in an act of extreme self-care, I've decided to trust my own honest rhythms and take a longer break before I continue on with the series. So I'll see you in the late fall, and as always, thank you so much for tuning in. Keep on trusting your gut and moving toward what moves you. Ciao.